When I was 4 months old, my parents left me on my grandparents' doorstep. No note, no reason, just silence. 4 months. I couldn't even hold my head up properly. I couldn't speak. I couldn't ask why. And they didn't bother to explain. They just left, walked away like I was a package they decided they didn't want anymore. Return to sender, no forwarding address. 30 years later, they walked into court demanding the $3.4 million estate my grandfather left me. $3.4 million. That's what it took to bring them back. Not my first word, not my first day of school, not my graduation, not my wedding, not even my grandfather's funeral. No, they showed up for money. Cold, hard cash. The only language they'd ever really spoken. You want to know what rage feels like? It's not hot. It's not explosive. Real rage is ice in your veins. It's the kind of cold that makes your hand shake when you're sitting across from people who share your DNA but never shared your life. It's looking into the eyes of strangers who call themselves your parents and seeing nothing but greed reflected back at you. They stood there in that courtroom, polished, well-dressed, confident, and claimed I manipulated a dying man, me, the 4-month-old baby they abandoned, the toddler who learned to walk holding my grandmother's hands because they weren't there, the child who waited by the window every birthday, thinking maybe this year they'd remember, the teenager who stopped waiting. They said I manipulated him, my grandfather, the man who taught me how to tie my shoes, how to ride a bike, how to be a decent human being, the man who showed up for every single moment of my life when they couldn't be bothered to show up for any of it. But let me start at the beginning. Let me tell you about the people who raised me and the people who didn't. I grew up in a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the kind of place where the ocean is both beautiful and brutal, where storms roll in without warning, and you learn early that nature doesn't care about your feelings. My grandparents' house sat on a hill overlooking the water, white clapboard with blue shutters, a wraparound porch where my grandfather would sit in his rocking chair every evening and watch the sun go down. That house was my entire world for the first 18 years of my life. My grandmother used to tell me I was their little miracle. She'd stroke my hair and say, "You came to us when we needed you most." I didn't understand what she meant until I was older, until I understood that her way of coping with her daughter abandoning her grandchild was to reframe it as a gift, as if the universe had sent me to fill the emptiness her own child had left behind. My grandfather was different. He didn't sugarcoat things. When I was 7 years old and asked him why my parents didn't want me, he sat me down on the porch steps and said, "Some people aren't built for the hard work of loving someone else more than themselves. That's not your fault. That's their failing, not yours." He was a man of few words, my grandfather, but every word mattered. Every word counted. He taught me that actions speak louder than words, that integrity isn't about what you say, but what you do when no one's watching. He was a fisherman, started working on boats when he was 14 years old, saved every penny, eventually bought his own vessel. He taught me about the ocean, how to read the weather, how to respect the power of water, how to navigate by the stars when the fog rolls in and you can't see 2 feet in front of you. He taught me that sometimes you have to weather the storm because there's no other choice. You can't outrun it. You can only hold steady and survive it. Those early years are fragments of warmth in my memory. Saturday morning breakfasts with my grandmother, making pancakes in the shape of animals, elephants and turtles and birds. My grandfather teaching me to bait a hook, even though it made my grandmother cringe. Christmas mornings, with just the three of us, the tree covered in ornaments we'd made together. Most of them lopsided and imperfect and absolutely beautiful because they were ours. Summer afternoons reading on the porch while the cicadas screamed and the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, and the silence where my parents should have been. That silence was its own presence. It sat at the dinner table with us. It occupied the space in the photo albums where their pictures should have been. It echoed in the questions I learned not to ask because the answers hurt too much. I used to write them letters. Did you know that? From the time I was 6 until I was 13, I wrote letters to people I didn't even remember. My grandmother would help me at first, sounding out words, correcting my spelling. Later, I'd write them alone in my room at night. Dear Mom and Dad, how do you start a letter to ghosts? How do you tell strangers about your life? I'd tell them about school, about my friends, about the science fair project where I built a model lighthouse that actually worked, about the soccer team I joined, about the music recital where I played piano and messed up in the middle, but kept going because my grandfather always said finishing was more important than being perfect. I'd tell them everything and nothing. I'd ask them questions I knew they'd never answer. Where are you? Why did you leave? Don't you wonder about me? Don't you care? My grandmother would mail those letters to an address she'd kept from years ago. I don't know if they ever read them. I don't know if they ever even received them. Not a single one was ever answered. Not one. After 7 years and dozens of letters, I finally stopped. The silence was too loud. The rejection too complete. My grandfather never said anything about the letters, but I know he knew. I'd see him watching me sometimes with this look of such profound sadness that it made my chest ache. He'd pull me into a hug. These brief, fierce embraces that said everything words couldn't. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, he'd tell me. Don't you ever doubt that. But I did doubt it. Of course I did. What child doesn't internalize abandonment as their own failure? What kid doesn't look in the mirror and wonder what's so wrong with them, that their own parents couldn't love them? I carried that weight for years. It shaped me in ways I'm still untangling even now. My grandparents never spoke badly about my parents. Not once, even when I was angry. And God, was I angry sometimes? Even when I'd scream and cry and demand to know what was so terrible about me that they left, my grandparents never fed that anger. They'd hold me and let me rage, and then gently redirect. This isn't about you, my grandmother would say. This is about them, about their choices, about their inability to see the gift they were given. My grandfather would say, pain makes people do stupid things. Your parents were in pain, and instead of dealing with it, they ran. That's on them, not you, never you. I learned later, much later, what that pain was. My mother had severe postpartum depression, crippling, debilitating depression that made her unable to function. My father, instead of getting her help, instead of being a partner, decided the easier path was to remove the source of the stress, me. They packed a bag, drove me 6 hours to my grandparents' house, and left, Just like that. My mother apparently barely spoke for months afterward. My father threw himself into his work, into building his career, into anything that would distract him from the guilt. And you know what? I can understand depression. I can understand mental illness. I can even understand the desperate, irrational choices people make when they're drowning. What I can't understand, what I will never understand, is 30 years of silence, 30 years of not getting help, 30 years of choosing not to come back. Depression doesn't last 3 decades. At some point, it's not mental illness anymore. It's a choice. They got better, you see. My mother eventually got treatment, medication, therapy, all of it. My father's career took off. He became a successful investment banker, made more money than he knew what to do with. They had another child 5 years after they abandoned me, a son, my half-brother, though we've never met. They raised him. They were present for his life, his first words, his first steps, his soccer games, and piano recitals and graduation. Every milestone they missed in my life, they were there for in his. Every moment they could have come back for, they chose not to. And that's what burns. That's what keeps me up at night even now. It wasn't that they couldn't be parents. They just couldn't be my parents. My grandmother found out about my half-brother when I was 10. She saw a Christmas card they'd sent to a mutual friend. A family photo. My parents, smiling, with a 5-year-old boy between them. The perfect little family. Just missing one piece. Me, the discarded rough draft. The practice run they decided didn't count. She showed my grandfather that photo. I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did. I found it later in his desk drawer, creased and worn, like he'd looked at it many times. He'd written on the back in his careful handwriting, "Some people don't deserve the blessings they're given." He never told me about my half-brother. Neither did my grandmother. I found out on my own when I was 16, late one night on social media, scrolling through profiles of people I barely knew. I saw my father's company page, and there they were, the happy family, posts about baseball games, and family vacations, and high school applications, a whole entire life that didn't include me. I remember staring at that screen until my eyes burned. I remember the way my hand shook, the way something inside me just broke. Or maybe it finally calcified. Maybe that was the moment the last soft part of my heart, where they were concerned, turned to stone. I showed my grandfather the next morning, walked into the kitchen where he was reading the newspaper and drinking his coffee, and shoved my phone in his face. "Did you know?" I asked him. My voice was shaking. I was trying not to cry. "Did you know they had another kid?" He looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at me. "Yeah," he said. "I knew. And you didn't tell me. What good would it have done?" he asked. "Would knowing have made you feel better? Would it have changed anything?" "I had a right to know." "You had a right to a lot of things," he said quietly. "You had a right to parents who showed up, a right to a family that wanted you, a right to not feel like you were lacking something every single day of your life. But we don't always get our rights, kid. We get what we get. And what you got was me and your grandmother. So the question isn't what you had a right to. The question is, what are you going to do with what you have?" I hated him in that moment, hated the calm way he spoke, hated his practicality, hated that he was right. I wanted him to be angry with me. I wanted him to rage against the injustice of it all. I wanted him to validate every bitter, hurt feeling inside me. Instead, he stood up and pulled me into a hug. "They're fools," he said into my hair. "They're fools who don't know what they're missing. But you can't make people love you the way you need to be loved. You can only love the people who show up. And kid, I show up every single day. I show up for you." And he did. God, he did. Every single day of my life, that man showed up. He showed up when I was scared to go to middle school and sat with me on the porch the night before and told me stories about his own first day until I laughed. He showed up when I failed my driver's test the first time and took me out for ice cream and made me practice parallel parking until I could do it in my sleep. He showed up when I got my heart broken at 17 and didn't say a word, just sat next to me while I cried and handed me tissues and made sure I knew I wasn't alone. He showed up for every single moment that mattered and dozens that didn't. He showed up when it was easy and when it was hard, when I was delightful and when I was a nightmare teenager who slammed doors and said horrible things I didn't mean. He showed up when I got into college, a full scholarship to a school 300 miles away, and I could see the pride and the sadness warring in his face because he was losing me and gaining my future all at once. "You go," he told me the night before I left. We were on the porch again. We had all our important conversations on that porch, and the ocean was dark and restless below us. "You go, and you build the biggest, brightest life you can. You make it so big and so full that there's no room left for the hurt, and you remember that you're carrying our love with you, mine and your grandmother's. It doesn't matter how far you go, you're carrying it with you." College was freedom and terror in equal measure. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't know my story. I could be anyone. I could reinvent myself. I could be the girl with the normal family, the uncomplicated past, the easy smile that didn't hide years of abandonment issues. Except I couldn't, because those issues followed me. They colored every relationship I tried to build. Every time someone got close, I'd push them away. Every time someone said they cared, I waited for them to leave. It took 2 years of therapy to even begin to untangle the mess my parents' abandonment had created in my psyche. But I persevered. I graduated with honors, got a good job, built a career, made friends, eventually let someone in enough to fall in love, to get married, to start building my own family. And through it all, my grandparents were there. Phone calls every Sunday, visits home for holidays. Their presence in my life as constant and reliable as the tide. My grandmother died when I was 26. Sudden heart attack. She was in the garden one moment, gone the next. It was fast and painless, the doctor said, as if that made it hurt less. My grandfather was devastated. 62 years of marriage ended in a heartbeat. He moved through the funeral like a ghost, pale and silent, and so utterly lost that it terrified me. I stayed with him for 2 weeks afterward, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, making sure he ate, trying to fill the gaping hole my grandmother's absence had left. It was impossible, of course. You can't replace a person. You can't plug a hole that size. You can only sit in the grief and hope it doesn't swallow you whole. My parents didn't come to the funeral. I don't know if they even knew she died. Probably not. They'd severed all ties with that part of their life. My grandmother, their mother, the woman who raised them, who probably loved them despite everything, wasn't worth showing up for, not even in death. I was so angry, so unbelievably angry. I wanted them to hurt the way I was hurting. I wanted them to feel even a fraction of the loss, the grief, the absolute unfairness of losing someone who actually showed up for life. But anger is exhausting, and grief is heavy, and I didn't have energy for both. My grandfather eventually found his footing again, slowly, painfully, but he did it. He started going back out on the boat, started tending the garden my grandmother had loved, started living again, though you could see the sadness in his eyes, even when he smiled. We grew closer in those years after my grandmother died. I visited more often. We'd sit on that porch and talk for hours. He told me stories I'd never heard before, about his childhood, about meeting my grandmother, about the early days of their marriage, when they had nothing but love and determination. He told me about my mother as a child, and it hurt to hear about the girl she'd been before she became the woman who left me. She was bright, he said once, curious, always asking questions, always pushing boundaries. Your grandmother used to say she had fire in her, but somewhere along the way, that fire burned her up instead of lighting her path. I don't know when it happened. I don't know why, but she changed. And by the time you came along, she was so lost in her own pain that she couldn't see past it. Do you forgive her? I asked him. He was quiet for a long time. I forgive her for being human, he finally said, for being broken, for not being strong enough to fight through the pain. But I don't forgive her for staying gone. There's a difference between falling down and choosing to stay on the ground. She chose to stay down. That's unforgivable. Those words echoed in my mind years later, when everything fell apart. My grandfather started getting sick when he was 78. Small things at first, forgetting names, misplacing his keys, getting confused about what day it was. We thought it was just age, normal decline, but it progressed faster than normal aging should. The doctors ran tests, diagnosed him with early onset dementia. It was brutal, watching the man who had been my rock, my constant, slowly disappear. Some days he was fine, sharp and present, and exactly himself. Other days he barely knew where he was. He'd call me by my grandmother's name. He'd ask about people who'd been dead for years. He'd get frustrated and angry at his own failing mind. But even as his memory faded, some things remained. His love for me never wavered, even on his worst days. When he couldn't remember what year it was, or what he'd had for breakfast, he knew me. He knew my face. He knew I was his. My girl, he'd say. My good girl. You came back. I moved back home to take care of him. Left my job, my life, everything. My husband supported the decision. He'd met my grandfather, loved him, understood what he meant to me. We relocated our lives to that small coastal town, to the house on the hill, to the porch overlooking the ocean where I'd grown up. The next 4 years were the hardest of my life. Watching someone you love disappear in increments is a special kind of torture. It's grief without the finality of death. It's loss that keeps on losing. Every day something else slips away. Every day they're a little less themselves and a little more lost. But I showed up. Every single day, I showed up. I fed him and bathed him and held his hand when he was scared. I redirected him when he got confused. I played his favorite music and read him his favorite books. I took him out on the boat on his good days because the ocean always calmed him. I sat with him on the porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down, just like we'd done my whole life. And through it all, I handled his affairs. He'd been smart enough to set up power of attorney years earlier when the diagnosis first came through. He knew what was coming. He knew he'd need someone to manage his finances, his medical care, his life. He trusted me to do it, and I did. I managed everything, paid his bills, dealt with his investments, made sure his estate was in order. He'd been even more successful than I'd realized. That fishing boat he'd bought decades ago had been the first of several. He'd built a small fleet, hired good people, made smart investments. The man who'd started with nothing had built an empire worth millions, and he'd been careful with it, saved it, grew it. Not for himself. He lived simply, never cared much for material things. But for me. This is yours, he told me one day during a lucid moment about 2 years into his decline. We were in his lawyer's office, updating his will, making sure everything was ironclad. Everything I've built, everything I have, it's yours. You're the one who stayed. You're the one who showed up. You're the one who earned it. I don't want it, I told him, and I meant it. I just want you. He smiled at me with such tenderness that it broke my heart. I know. That's exactly why you're getting it. The will was clear, explicit. Everything to me. Every dollar, every asset, every piece of property. His lawyer made sure it was bulletproof. We knew, though we didn't say it out loud, that there might be challenges, that people might crawl out of the woodwork when he was gone, that blood relations might suddenly remember they had family when there was money involved. My grandfather lingered for 4 years after the diagnosis, 4 years of slowly fading, of good days and bad days, of moments of clarity surrounded by fog. He died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, peacefully, in his sleep, in the bed he'd shared with my grandmother for 6 decades. I was with him, holding his hand. I like to think he knew. I like to think he felt me there. The grief was enormous, oceanic. It swallowed me whole. I'd lost my anchor, my foundation, the person who had loved me most unconditionally in this world. The house felt impossibly empty without him. The silence was deafening. But I planned his funeral. I arranged everything exactly how he would have wanted it. Small service, people who actually knew him, who had actually shown up in his life. We buried him next to my grandmother, overlooking the ocean. I read from his favorite Yeats poem. I told stories that made people laugh and cry. I said goodbye to the man who had been more of a parent to me than my actual parents had ever been. And they didn't come, my parents. I'd sent them a notification through a mutual contact. Not an invitation, just information. Your father is dead. This is when and where we're burying him. They didn't come. They didn't call. They didn't send flowers. Nothing. Not even the basic courtesy of acknowledgement. I didn't expect anything different. But it still hurt, still burned, still reinforced everything I'd always known about them. That they were takers, not givers. That they showed up when it benefited them and disappeared when it didn't. The estate settled quickly. My grandfather's lawyer was efficient. Everything transferred to me exactly as planned. $3.4 million in assets. The house, the boats, the investments. A lifetime of careful planning and hard work. Now mine. I didn't want it for the money. I wanted it because it was his legacy, his life's work, the tangible proof that he'd existed, that he'd mattered, that he'd built something meaningful. I planned to use it wisely, to honor him with it, to maybe start a foundation in his name, something to help kids like me who'd been abandoned, to turn his generosity into something that would outlast all of us. I had 6 weeks of peace, 6 weeks to grieve and plan and start imagining what came next. And then they showed up, not in person, not at first. They sent lawyers, expensive ones, from a big city firm. They filed a lawsuit contesting the will, claiming undue influence, claiming I'd manipulated a man with dementia into leaving everything to me, claiming that as his daughter, who hadn't spoken to him in 3 decades, my mother had legal right to his estate. That blood trumped everything. That DNA mattered more than decades of love and presence and showing up. I remember the moment I got served with the papers. I was in the garden, planting flowers in the spot where my grandmother used to grow tomatoes. It was a beautiful spring day. Warm sun, cool breeze, the smell of salt and earth and growing things. And then a process server showed up at the gate and handed me an envelope that detonated my entire world. I sat in the dirt and read the lawsuit. Every word was a knife, every claim a betrayal. They said I'd isolated him. They said I'd taken advantage of his declining mental state. They said I'd systematically cut them out and poisoned him against them. Me, the abandoned infant, the discarded child. I was the villain in their story. The rage that filled me in that moment was biblical. It was Old Testament, vengeful God. Pillar of salt, cities burning kind of rage. How dare they? How fucking dare they? They had abandoned me. They had chosen 30 years of silence. They had missed every single important moment of my life and dozens of unimportant ones. They had let me believe I was unlovable, unwanted, fundamentally flawed. And now that there was money involved, now they wanted to claim family ties. I called my grandfather's lawyer from the garden. My hands were shaking so hard, I could barely dial. "They're suing me," I said when he answered. "My parents are suing me for the estate." There was a long pause. "I was afraid this might happen," he said quietly. "Okay, don't worry. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." The next 6 months were hell. Pure, unrelenting hell. Discovery, depositions, endless legal motions and paperwork and court filings. My parents' lawyers were aggressive, ruthless. They painted me as a manipulative opportunist who'd wormed her way into an old man's life for his money. They claimed my grandfather had been mentally incompetent for years, that any decisions he'd made regarding his estate should be nullified. They demanded financial records going back decades. They wanted proof of every dollar my grandfather had spent on me, every birthday gift, every college payment, every bit of support. They claimed it was evidence of undue influence, as if love could be measured in dollars, as if caring for someone was a crime. And through it all, they never once tried to contact me directly, never picked up the phone, never sent a letter. Everything was through lawyers, cold and clinical and utterly devoid of humanity. They were strangers, fighting me for money, nothing more. The worst part, the absolute worst part, was that I had to see them at depositions, at court hearings. I had to sit across tables from them in sterile conference rooms and listen to them lie. Listen to them claim they'd wanted to be in my life, But I'd prevented it. Listen to them paint my grandfather as a senile old man who'd been controlled by his grasping granddaughter. My mother looked older than I'd expected. Polished, expensive clothes, perfect makeup, designer handbag. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Not once during the entire deposition. She stared at a point over my shoulder and recited her rehearsed answers in a flat, emotionless voice. She said she'd suffered from depression after my birth, that she'd needed time to heal, that she'd always planned to come back for me, but circumstances had prevented it. What circumstances? My lawyer asked. She blinked, faltered. It was complicated, she said. Can you be more specific? It was difficult. You don't understand. Help me understand, my lawyer said. What prevented you from maintaining contact with your daughter for 30 years? Silence. Long, damning silence. I was afraid, she finally whispered. Of what? Of failing again, of not being enough, of hurting her worse by coming back. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and scream until my voice gave out. Because that's not love. That's cowardice. That's selfishness, wrapped in a thin veneer of self-protection. Real love shows up even when it's scared. Real love does the hard thing. Real love doesn't abandon a baby and then have the audacity to claim it was for that baby's own good. My father was worse, cold, calculating, completely unemotional. He treated the whole thing like a business transaction. When asked why he'd never contacted me, he said, "It seemed like she was being well cared for. We didn't want to disrupt her life." As if I was a stock portfolio he was monitoring from a distance. As if my life was something that could be disrupted by the presence of my own parents. When asked about my half-brother, he said, "That situation was different. We were in a different place in our lives, more stable, more prepared for the responsibilities of parenthood." So you were prepared to be parents to your son, but not to your daughter? My lawyer asked. We were younger when she was born. We made mistakes. We've grown since then. Did you ever try to correct those mistakes? Did you ever reach out to her? We felt it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. Sleeping dogs. That's what I was to him. A problem best left undisturbed. A mistake filed away and forgotten. Until that mistake inherited millions of dollars. And suddenly, it was worth waking the dogs. The trial was set for 6 months after they filed the lawsuit. 6 months of preparation, of building our case, of gathering evidence. My lawyer, a tough woman in her 60s who'd known my grandfather for years, was confident. We have everything we need, she told me. Medical records showing his mental competency up until the very end. Financial records proving he was in full control of his faculties when he made his decisions. Testimony from doctors, neighbors, friends. They don't have a leg to stand on. Then why am I so scared? I asked her. Because they're your parents, she said gently. And no matter how much they've hurt you, no matter how much you know they don't deserve anything, there's still a part of you that wants them to love you, that wants them to choose you. This trial is that want dying. It's hard, but you're going to get through it. The courtroom was modern and sterile, nothing like the oak-paneled rooms you see on TV. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, hard wooden benches that made your back ache. It should have been dramatic, this showdown, this final confrontation. Instead, it was just sad, exhausting. A bunch of people in uncomfortable chairs, arguing about whether love could be quantified and whether DNA was destiny. My parents' lawyer opened with the same arguments from their filings, that I'd isolated my grandfather, that I'd taken advantage of his dementia, that I'd systematically turned him against his own daughter. He called me calculating, manipulative, a con artist who'd spent years setting up the perfect long game. And you know what made me laugh? Actually, laugh out loud in that courtroom, was the absurdity of it. The idea that I, as a 4-month-old baby, had somehow masterminded this entire scheme, that I'd been playing a 30-year-long con, that everything, every moment of love, every sacrifice, every time I showed up, had all been an elaborate plot to steal money from people who wanted nothing to do with me. Our lawyer's opening was simple, straightforward. She laid out the facts like a roadmap. This case is about one question. What makes a family? Is it biology, DNA, the accident of birth, or is it love, presence, the daily choice to show up for someone? The respondent's parents chose biology. They'll stand here and tell you that blood creates obligation, that their DNA entitles them to a share of an estate built by a man they never spoke to, created for a woman they abandoned. But the evidence will show you something different. It will show you 30 years of love, of sacrifice, of showing up. It will show you who really deserved to be called family. They called my mother to the stand first. Watching her walk up there, raise her right hand, swear to tell the truth. It was surreal. This woman who'd given birth to me, but never been my mother. This stranger, with my eyes and my nose, and none of my history. The direct examination was what you'd expect. Softball questions from her own lawyer, designed to paint her in the best possible light. Yes, she'd struggled with depression. Yes, she'd been young and overwhelmed. Yes, she'd made the difficult choice to leave me with her parents because she'd thought it was best for everyone. Yes, she'd always planned to reconnect, but time had gotten away from her. Life had gotten complicated. Before she knew it, decades had passed. Then came the cross-examination. Mrs. Patterson, my lawyer said, you testified that you left your daughter with your parents because you thought it was best for her. Is that correct? Yes. And you testified that you always planned to reconnect with her. Correct. Yes. Can you tell me about any attempts you made to do so? My mother blinked. I thought about it many times. Thinking isn't doing, Mrs. Patterson. Did you call? No. Did you write? No. Did you visit? No. Did you send birthday cards, Christmas cards, any acknowledgement whatsoever that you had a daughter? It was complicated. Yes, you've said that. Let me ask you this. Did you have another child? A son? Yes. And how old is he? 25. So you had him 5 years after you left your daughter, correct? Yes. Were you still depressed then? I was getting treatment. I was better. Better enough to raise a child? Yes. But not better enough to reach out to the child you'd already had. Silence. Mrs. Patterson, let me be very clear. You got better. You got treatment. You recovered enough to have another child, to raise that child, to be present in his life. But you never once tried to be present in your daughter's life. Is that correct? I thought she was better off without me. Did you ask her? Did you ask your parents? Did you make any attempt whatsoever to find out if that was true? Or did you just assume it because it was easier than doing the hard work of being a mother? Objection. their lawyer called. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. But the damage was done. The truth was out there, hanging in the air like smoke. My lawyer pulled out a stack of papers. Mrs. Patterson, I am showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 12. Do you recognize these? My mother looked at the papers. Her face went white. Those are letters. Letters from your daughter to you. 43 letters over the course of 7 years. Letters telling you about her life, asking where you were, begging you to write back. Did you receive these letters? Yes. Did you respond to any of them? No. Did you read them? Some of them. Some of them. Your daughter wrote you 43 letters over 7 years, and you read some of them, but never once replied. Is that your testimony? Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Can you explain to the court why you never responded? I didn't know what to say. You didn't know what to say to a child who was begging for contact with her mother? My mother started crying, actual tears streaming down her face, and I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. No sympathy, no sadness, just a cold, empty void where any feelings for her should have been. Those tears were 30 years too late. No further questions, my lawyer said. My father's testimony was shorter, more clinical. He admitted everything with the detached air of someone confessing to minor tax fraud. Yes, they'd left me. Yes, they'd never contacted me. Yes, they'd had another child. Yes, they'd been present for that child's life. No, he didn't think that was hypocritical. They'd been different people then. They'd grown, matured, become ready for parenthood. But you were already parents, my lawyer pointed out. You already had a child. We weren't ready, he said flatly. And when did you become ready? Give me a specific timeline. When did you wake up one day and think, now I'm ready to be a father? He couldn't answer, because the truth was obvious to everyone in that courtroom. He'd become ready when he'd had a child he actually wanted, when parenthood fit into his life plan, when it was convenient. I hadn't been convenient. I'd been a mistake, an inconvenience, something to be dealt with and moved past. Then came our witnesses, a parade of people who'd been there, who'd seen, who knew the truth. My grandfather's doctor testified about his mental state, showed medical records proving he'd been sharp and competent until the final 6 months of his life, explained that his will had been updated years before his dementia had progressed to the point of affecting his judgment. Mr. Harrison knew exactly what he was doing, the doctor said. He was of sound mind. He made his choices deliberately and with full understanding of what they meant. My grandfather's lawyer testified about the multiple conversations they'd had about the will, about how my grandfather had been crystal clear about his intentions. He told me explicitly that he wanted everything to go to his granddaughter. The lawyer said, he said, and I quote, "She's the one who showed up. She's the one who earned it. Blood doesn't make you family. Love makes you family." He said that over and over. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't me putting words in his mouth. It was his truth. The neighbors testified. The couple who'd lived next door for 40 years. They talked about watching me grow up, about seeing me care for my grandparents, about the years I'd spent taking care of my grandfather when he was sick. She gave up her whole life to come home and care for him, the wife said. She was there every single day. Every single day. We never once saw her parents. Not once in 30 years. My grandfather's business partner testified, talked about how sharp my grandfather had been right up until the end, how he'd been involved in business decisions until just a few months before he died. He knew his mind, the partner said. He knew what he was doing with his money, and he was very clear that he wanted it to go to his granddaughter. He talked about her all the time, how proud he was, how much she'd sacrificed. He said she was the best thing that ever happened to him. And then came the evidence, the financial records my lawyer had subpoenaed, every dollar my grandfather had ever spent on me, meticulously documented. And you know what those records showed? Nothing excessive, nothing unusual, normal grandparent expenses, birthday gifts, Christmas presents, help with college tuition, the same amount he would have given to any grandchild. Nothing that suggested I was manipulating him or bleeding him dry. Just the normal, expected support of someone raising a child. But the records also showed something else, something their lawyer hadn't expected. For the first 5 years after my parents left me, my grandfather had been sending them money, $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year, for 5 years, $300,000 total, sent to help ease their burden, to give them time to get on their feet, to support them while they got their lives together. Money they'd never mentioned, money they'd taken without question, money that proved my grandfather had tried to help them, had given them every opportunity to get better and come back. They'd taken the money and used it to build their new life, the life that didn't include me. Mr. Patterson, my lawyer said during redirect, were you aware that your father-in-law sent you $300,000 over 5 years? My father's jaw tightened. Yes. Did he ask for anything in return? He suggested we use the time to get back on our feet, to eventually reconnect with our daughter. And did you? No. Did you ever pay him back? It was a gift. So you took $300,000 from a man you now claim manipulated his granddaughter into stealing from you. Is that your position? That's different. How is it different? It just is. It wasn't different. It was exactly the same. My grandfather had shown them grace, had given them support, had held out hope that they'd come back. And they'd taken his money and his hope and used it to build a life without me, without him, without any of us. Then came my testimony. I'd been dreading it for months. The idea of sitting up there, exposed and vulnerable, while they tried to tear me apart, while they tried to paint me as the villain in a story where I'd only ever been the victim. My lawyer started gentle, asked me about my childhood, about my grandparents, about what it had been like growing up with them. I told the truth. I talked about the love, the stability, the way they'd shown up for every moment of my life. I talked about the hole where my parents should have been, about the letters I'd written, about the birthdays they'd missed, about learning to live with an absence that never quite stopped aching. Did your grandfather ever speak to you about his will? She asked. Yes, multiple times over the years. What did he say? He said he wanted me to have everything. He said I'd earned it by showing up, by being there. He said family wasn't about blood. It was about love and presence and choice. He said his daughter, my mother, had made her choice 30 years ago, and he'd made his. Did you ever ask him to leave you his estate? God, no. I didn't want it. I wanted him. I would have given every penny back in a heartbeat to have him here for one more day. But he insisted. He insisted. He said it was important to him, that it was his legacy, his way of showing me that I mattered, that I'd always mattered, that I was his real family. Then came the cross-examination. Their lawyer was brutal, systematic. He tried to paint me as calculating. He asked detailed questions about my grandfather's finances, about when I'd moved back home, about the timing of the will updates. He was looking for anything, any crack, any inconsistency, any hint that I had manipulated or coerced or influenced my grandfather improperly. But I had the truth on my side, and the truth was simple. I'd loved my grandfather. I cared for him because I loved him, not because I wanted his money. I'd given up years of my life because he was worth it, because after a lifetime of him showing up for me, it was my turn to show up for him. Miss Harrison, the lawyer said, isn't it true that you stood to inherit millions of dollars by caring for your grandfather? I stood to inherit his love, I said. Everything else was just things, money, assets. I didn't care about any of that. I cared about him. But you knew about the will. Of course I knew about the will. He told me about it. He wanted me to know. But knowing about something and doing something to get it are two very different things. You moved back home conveniently when he became ill. I moved back home because he needed me, because I couldn't stand the thought of him being alone or in some facility with strangers, because he'd spent my entire life making sure I was never alone, and I was going to make damn sure he wasn't alone either. And it didn't occur to you that your parents might have wanted to be involved in his care? I laughed, actually laughed out loud in that courtroom. My parents? The people who hadn't spoken to him in 30 years? The people who abandoned their child with him and never looked back? Those parents? No, it didn't occur to me. Just like it didn't occur to them to show up for his funeral. Just like it didn't occur to them to show up for any moment of his life, or mine, until there was money involved. Objection, their lawyer said. Sustained, the judge said. The witness will refrain from editorializing. But it was out there. The truth, raw and ugly and undeniable. The lawyer tried a different tack. Miss Harrison, isn't it true that you prevented your parents from seeing your grandfather? No, that's absolutely not true. They never tried to see him. Not once. I couldn't prevent something that never happened. But if they had tried, they didn't try. That's the point. They had 30 years to try. They had his address, his phone number. They knew where to find him. They chose not to. You can't rewrite history just because it's convenient now. So you're saying if your mother had called and asked to see him, you would have allowed it. I thought about that. Really thought about it. I don't know, I finally said. Honestly, I don't know.